Everyone, the time has come to deal with these thorny questions of the governance of state-owned enterprises. I want to welcome everyone back from the coffee break. We did give you a little extra time. They told me I was being too severe. The next panel will be on the governance of state-owned enterprises. And I am going to pass it over to Mateo Patronebrd, Managing Director for the Eastern Europe and Caucasus regions at the EBRD. Mateo.
Thank you very much, Norman, and thank you very much, everybody, for being here. It's really, I'm really delighted to welcome you for this discussion on a topic that, for us, is extremely important in the country. As you know, the Ukrainian market is one of the most important from the EBRD. We like to say that the EBRD is the largest institutional investor in the country, but it's actually the opposite is true. Ukraine is one of the biggest markets for the EBRD. And before the conflict, we used to invest about 1 billion euros per year. And in 2023, we invested 1.7 billion euros per year last year. And actually, I had to leave the previous panel because we signed another transaction today with a state-owned bank, but focus on providing finance to small municipalities and SMEs. And that brings our activities for 2023 to 800 million euros so far. Oh, thank you. No, that, I was not fishing for that. But
this is a paid political announcement.
But indeed, quite a lot of what we are doing is in the state sector, is in the state-owned enterprises sector, including in energy, Naftogaz, Ukrenergo, hopefully very soon with Ukrenergo, but also in the transport sector with Ukrzaliznytsia. So for us, this is a very important topic. And I must say that the reform of the state-owned sector in the country has not followed a linear trajectory since 2014. We had a few periods of success, a few periods of some headaches, and we will discuss some of those with my fellow panelists. And but I'm also glad to be able to say that in the past few months, and ironically, indeed, during the conflict, we had quite a significant progress on many fronts, and indeed, we will discuss some of them with my fellow panelists. And I think there are two pillars of intervention. One is the legislative intervention, and there is a draft law in the Rada, the 5593D, that needs to be approved, hopefully in the autumn. But also we will continue to work on at the company level with the introduction of best practices of corporate governance, with the introduction of new supervisory boards, and we will discuss about the experience of Naftogaz, for instance. And then again, there are cases of success, like for instance, Ukrenergo, cases of incipient success, like the one of Naftogaz, and cases that still needs attention, like the gas TSO. But let me stop here, and without further ado, let me introduce the panelists. And first of all, the Deputy Minister of Economy of Ukraine, Alexey, and Rustem Umerov, the head of the State Property Fund of Ukraine Online, Ludo von der Leyen, the Naftogaz Supervisory Board member, but also Emeritus Professor of Corporate Governance at INSEAD. I benefited from him twice during my MBA, and then after that, after about 20 years for the International Directors Program Executive Management at INSEAD. And we have the CEO of Naftogaz, Alexey Chernyshov, online as well, and my friend Daniel Bilak, who is a partner and director of Kinsteller in Ukraine. Let me start with Alexey. So Alexey, there is quite a bit to be done, and tell us what is the government planning.
Okay, so, thank you so much for this panel and for EBRD organizing and everybody participating in them. I think it's been terrific, and as Mateo just said during the break, like no pressure, keep it up. So how the government looks at the corporate governance, and we have a lot of state property still. And we don't need all of that. So basically there are two angles, and we look at the state property as a mostly vehicle for investment. What we know is that Ukraine so far hasn't been able to, I don't know, for example, do IPOs or partial placements of its state-owned companies. That's how it is hard to attract the capital inside the state companies, or as probably the one option are loans, like EBRD usually does. But for that, good corporate governance is required. So basically, state property is a vehicle for investment. That's the angle that the Ministry of Economy is looking at. Which means that the strategy breaks on two parts. One is to privatize as much as possible, and the ministry has compiled a list of strategic companies. There's going to be slightly above 100 strategic companies. The list is going to be is passed for voting at the Cabinet of Ministers, and then should be voted at Verkhovna Rada. The rest should be privatized. That's one, and we're working actively on transferring the companies to state property fund. We transferred more than 1,000, and just there is another Cabinet of Ministers decree of transferring another 30 to the state property fund. So that's work that's been going on. For the ones that are staying, we definitely need to improve corporate governance. That's how the ministry is running these transparent competitions for independent supervisory board members. The easier part this year would be to update the regulation on these competitions. They work well, I guess, even during the wartime, as the last competition saw both for Naftogaz, Ukrposhta, then for state-owned banks. But the regulation is a bit messy, so we need to get that updated. I don't think that there's going to be like problems or struggles. This is just a technical job, but we're sure on the track to actually do that. The harder part would be to get 5593D voted in the parliament. We need to work, everyone needs to work with the parliament to get the law passed in the best way possible by the middle of autumn. So that would be the main task during the next like 3-4 months for us, and we're very keen to actually do what's feasible and what is needed. So the main idea is to have a law that would actually allow to attract investment in those companies after the corporate governance. So that's the angle that we see. And what else? The state of the state property is, there is one complication, is that because of the war and of the aggression, we have to nationalize companies. So we're looking at it like that. What we found out is that there are Russian interests tied to Russian government that help Russia conduct its wars of aggression in many of the strategic companies, not in state property, but in private property. So it's the task of the government to get Russians out of those companies, get like just regular Ukrainian business without ties to Russia in. So which means nationalizing the companies and then selling them back again. This is also a messy process. And it's a tricky one, and nobody really wants to touch it that much. I think, like in the panel before that, we discussed cases about Nabu and Kobolev and Pivovarsky. I'm not sure if you're not gonna hearing about me in those cases with these things, but just like this stuff needs to be done, and it just shows the problem of the state property. Like we're gonna privatize a bit, right? But then the property would expand, and we will privatize that bit as well. So this is an immense task, and we thank for help for anyone's helping, because it's like our common goal. And our big partner in that is Rustem Umerov, because many of those privatizations go through Rustem's State Property Fund and Prozora Sale. And what else? I guess that's it.
Thank you very much for very concise, but yeah.
Oh no, sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
Then
I
yes.
take back the compliment.
Right. The corporatization part, but I guess like this is also important, right? So we're working on corporatizing Energoatom. So it actually corporatizations will allow the company to attract capital. So that's the same angle. It's also a very lengthy process just because the company is huge, and we're also involved into corporatizing or this. Gas pipelines operator, the Deloitte and Dorada. We're in constant contact with the ministry, with the energy community and the parliamentarians on that. And we also included this OKTSU into the list of companies that have independent supervisory board selection procedure according to 777 regulations. So we plan to do everything like in the best way possible. And another area, I guess, maybe Garpok, the operator of electricity market will be corporatized, hopefully. And there is also a reform of Ukrbronprom that's also connected to corporatization. So even during the wartime, Ukraine is doing what's right, and we try a lot, and we try to do what's best for the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexey. And seriously, I think a lot of the progress that we have witnessed in the past few months have quite a bit to do with your professionalism and enthusiasm in working in the direction of reforming the SOE sector in Ukraine. But since you mentioned the State Property Fund, let me turn to Rustem. Rustem, you now have consolidating the lion's share indeed of SOEs in your portfolio. And tell us what is your vision in order to improve the professionalism, both in the governance and in the management of those SOEs?
Sure. First of all, we would like to become a main institutional investment platform to take over from EBRD and others, so that we could finalize the capability building and capacity building as everybody wishes Ukraine to be capable of doing it. So it's our vision. Secondly, we would like to finalize the reform of State Property Fund by creating new instruments. First one is to stop manipulating on the strategic assets. So we are making the criteria, and we will welcome any proposals from the IFIs and sovereign institutions to advise us what could be called strategic. By strategic, it is, as you know, there are 3,600 assets in the country, and up to 1% we call strategic, and we consult sometimes with large, let's say, companies such as Naftogaz and others to think, let's say, what do they think, but there is a roadmap needs to be done by establishing, let's say, a strategy on how the Ukrainian Sovereign Fund will be working. And then we have to pass the new law on Ukrainian Sovereign Fund, then criteria, put the strategy, and then start, let's say, consolidating the vision among all the stakeholders and making the Ukrainian Sovereign Fund work. The focus of the State Property Fund, as I said, firstly, to create this Ukrainian Sovereign Fund and focus on strategic assets. The second thing is, of course, what is not strategic, we have to sell everything except dignity. And we are working for the last 8 months we've resumed the privatization. The Ministry of Economy in the cabinet was vital and Parliament was vital to have a support. So we started minor privatization, and now we just signed a new law on resuming the large-scale privatization. So in this, we sell everything transparently from Prozoro mechanism. So this is our second priority. The third priority, that assets and resources have lands and properties, real estate. So that's why consolidating it, we would like to launch a real estate investment trust. At the moment, Ukraine possesses 8 million square meters of properties, and we would like to make a portfolio of those who could be leased for a long term and make a public company REIT. So this is our third product that we will be focusing on. A land side, 31 years of discussions whether Ukraine should own the land. Out of 24 million hectares, we're trying to consolidate within the state-owned enterprises all the land that will belong to the state. It is up to 700 or 1 million hectares, let's say, of land. Then we will make it very transparently, leasing it to the long-term let's say, investors. The next product that State Property Fund would be focusing is to attract industrial investors through the Made in Ukraine project that we are designing along with the Ministry of Economy and others. So those are the priorities of the State Property Fund. As for the transparency, transition, and expertise, of course, nobody wants to clean the junk and make the work on the bottom level. So when international institutions would like to enter to Ukraine, they focus on to the large companies. What we do is that cabinet has transferred 65% of assets to State Property Fund, what he owes. We already sent 85% of what has been given to us to liquidation and bankruptcy by passing the law. Additional 11% on the top, it's a large-scale privatization that we just present signed the law, and remaining 4% will be a land bank. So this way, we finish what has been given by cabinet in 6 months, and we will be focusing now to transfer additional remaining 1,000+ assets towards us, where we will be doing the same cleaning. Some will be sent to privatization, some to land bank, some to real estate investment trust, and some to the Ukrainian sovereign fund. So this is the snapshot of what we do, how we do, and we always welcome the professional service advisors, IFIs. What we did along with others was very hard, but some are keen to work with us. Most are still looking whether we will survive. But I would say that we're not only good fighters, we will make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rustem. Very, very comprehensive and interesting list of tasks. But let me now move to one of the major SOEs in the country, and in particular to its CEO, Alexey Chernyshev. Alexey, I always remember our first meeting as soon as you got appointed as CEO, and you said, my first task is I need to establish trust in the company. And I must say that from our own experience, this is really mission accomplished, at least from our perspective. But tell us your story. What is happening? What you have done so far, and what is the joint work of yourself, the management team, the supervisory board, and the shareholder?
Thank you very much, Mateo. Dear panelists, dear guests, it is my pleasure to be with you today. First of all, I would like to state that Naftogaz is proud of cooperation with EBRD, and we are grateful for constant support. This support is enormous, and it has been actually increased during the course of this week, and we have signed a new agreement of increasing the current support which will bring Ukraine to a better position in the way of resilience and stability of energy supply. We are speaking about the emergency gas supplies and purchases. And as well, I'm very grateful to BRD for the support of the process of restructuring of Naftogaz Eurobonds, which will also gain more trust to the company. The company itself, for those who doesn't know, is the biggest Ukrainian.
Alexey, sorry, can I stop you there for a second? Can we increase the volume? Shall we try again?
Yes, can I continue?
If you can shout, that would be...
Or increase the volume.
I speak straight to the microphone.
Okay, perfect. That's perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. So first of all, for those who doesn't know Naftogaz, Naftogaz is the biggest Ukrainian SOE and the most strategic one in the way of the production, transit, supply, upstream, midstream, and downstream of oil and gas and other types of energy. Clearly, and we all know that, Ukraine is in desperate need for reforms. This will underline and project its future, the speed we would access it. Corporate governance reform is one of them. The success of Naftogaz is very important. For years, Naftogaz has been implementing corporate governance reform inside the company, and I think is still a vanguard of the corporate governance reform in Ukraine. Naftogaz is a solid institution that implemented OECD principles into its nature. Naftogaz has elected, of course, the government has elected the supervisory board, a fantastic board with independent members that guide the company towards its brighter future. And we have successful cooperation and benefiting from the results of the corporate governance reform. I'm sure that our joint task is to make the corporate governance reform irreversible to Naftogaz and Ukraine in general. And I'm sure Naftogaz will be a guideline for other SOEs in Ukraine, how to implement the reform and the way it should be implemented. I'm sure Naftogaz will play the leading role. And in this regard, I would like to continue the idea of the fact that Ukrainian SOEs would be the basis for the future investment into the country. Actually, it's a great vehicle and the current vehicle that should be used for further development. I would like to stop a little bit on Ukrainian reform agenda. I clearly believe it's an absolute precondition for Ukrainian recovery and for Ukrainian development. And I think sometimes it makes sense to discuss not only the recovery, but also reforms, which is the same letter to start, but should be developed simultaneously. Ukraine is in desperate need for reforms agenda package to be implemented, including corporate governance, energy market, court system, law enforcement system, and many more. I'm sure the dedication of the Ukrainian government to the reform agenda and success of it would pave the way to further investment and recovery of Ukraine, which is obviously is conditional to the volume of private investors willing to come to the country. We all know the great assets Ukraine owns, and Rustem has just underlined them. I'm sure it's going to be a great project for the future. But before the privatization will be successful, certain reforms should be completed. And I believe it is the way Ukraine should go. Within this context, I would like again to welcome EBRD that has always been a supporter and motivator for different Ukrainian governments to implement those reforms agenda package. And I'm sure EBRD will remain dedicated to this idea. And obviously, the success of Naftogaz, the company that implemented corporate governance values and is being guided by it, would be the great example for all SOE infrastructure in Ukraine. Naftogaz has OECD principles as a guideline and almost a Bible for its existence. And I'm sure the way Ukrainian SOEs will go this style and way of management, they will be more interesting for investment, for international investment. And I'm sure the state property fund will complete its job faster than it might take time in the current circumstances. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexey, and thank you very much for making the connection indeed between the recovery process and the reform process. And that is particularly important as a catalyzer for private sector investments, how we have heard this week. But you also mentioned that you want to make the corporate governance reform at Naftogaz an irreversible process. But indeed, well, we had a few reversals in Naftogaz in the past. And I'm turning to Ludo, who is obviously a thought leader in corporate governance, but he's also been in the supervisory board of Naftogaz twice. This is the second experience for him, and hopefully it's going to be a more pleasant one. The third one, okay, but hopefully this one is going to be true actually, because and this one is going to be a more pleasant than the previous two or the previous one with an interruption of 48 hours. Over to you, Ludo.
Well, corporate governance is a subtle topic and is part of the culture. And in that sense, you know, every country has its own culture. And I think the world is converging to a more uniform corporate governance culture. But you cannot sort of say that the US, France, and the UK have the same corporate governance cultures, you know, in terms of practice. So that brings us to Ukraine. And I'm very positive about this new board. I mean, we had a great meeting in Kiev, you know, with Alexey and with the state representatives. I think we have everything we need. I must congratulate again the Ukrainian government, because there are very few governments who would actually give one of their major companies to be supervised by a majority of foreigners. That is actually not common, you know, that 4 out of the 6 members, there's one missing seat for Ukrainian, but that the majority would actually be foreigners. I think is quite a testimony, and I think that goes in terms of that probably will be temporary. I don't think that needs to last, but I think for the current moment where so much money comes from abroad, I think that is probably a good thing, because it will attract. And I would say, when do you need a board? When you're actually managing other people's money, because you cannot trust the CEO without, you know, sort of having a proper board. So if the foreigners will invest, they will want to have a board which is not just accountable, but responsible, you know, that the money is well used. And I think that is the purpose of the board. We don't do anything. The executive board, you know, executes. We are the supervisory board. And then there is actually the owners board. And I think I would like to underline that the appointment of a sovereign wealth fund, state property fund, gives an ownership function which is much more effective than the Council of Ministers, who has so many issues that I don't think they can sort of necessarily, you know, take a long-term view. So I think in that sense, everything is laid out. I should say that for the moment, I think we should meet again in a year, because governance, you can appoint new people quickly, but to have impact, it takes time. We should probably meet, you know, once a year and have an account. And that's the whole purpose of the General Assembly, which is what have you done and what is the transformation. So that I think is my first point. My second point is there are people who do not like governance, and these are entrepreneurs. And there is a lot of entrepreneurial character in Ukraine. And these people hate. I mean, I will be sort of neutral, and I will mention Elon Musk. I don't think Elon Musk is is a fantastic entrepreneur, had a fantastic influence on the world. but he's a one-person board, you know, and that goes with the nature, because as the French say, entrepreneurs like to entreprendre, they like to do things, and so for them the board is a hassle, and it's a bureaucracy, you know. And I think I actually believe bureaucracies, again, in governance should be good bureaucracies, not bad bureaucracies. So the problem is not bureaucracy. The problem is the effectiveness of bureaucracy. But let me say that the culture of governance was not there in Ukraine, because it was very entrepreneurial in various ways. You can call the oligarchs extremely entrepreneurial. You saw what Kolomoisky did with Privatbank. I mean, it's remarkable what he was able to achieve. Not only did he build a great organization, and then he actually sort of got himself a loan of a couple of billions and ran away with it. So very well, not sustainable though. So basically, we have to build, I think, a governance culture in Ukraine. And I think that's the process. And I think, for me, let's not make too complicated. I like it when Alexey mentions the Bible. You know, the OECD guidelines is all we need. We do not, Ukraine is not that different that we need a different guidelines. Let's just apply what we have and do a good job, and give the autonomy to the board. And then the rule of the game is, if the owner is not happy, then you change the board. And that is part of the game as well. Now, having been fired by the government of Ukraine for resisting their temptation to appoint a new CEO, who we said would destroy the company, you know, we were fired. But then the answer is, he then destroyed the company. So we were right. And I think that's what Alexey is referring to, which is, you know, can we gain the trust again? And to gain the trust again, I mean, the worst person you want to trust is the person who says, trust me. So you need to institutionalize trust. And that is what the board is doing. And I think it's ongoing work. I didn't think I would be reappointed. I actually did my best not to be reappointed, but somehow I passed the thing. And let's not forget, owners can destroy value. Mr. Musk has destroyed a lot of value. Twitter was a remarkable company, trying to have decent conversations over the internet. And basically, you know, he went back. And so owners, owners have a big role in setting up, allowing governance, and to abide what is, I think, something that is very poorly understood, which is owners are not responsible for the company. It's the board that is responsible for the company. So the owners are responsible for appointing board members who actually are responsible for the company, and who appoint the executive, and then, you know, et cetera. So I think that principle is, I think, not sufficiently understood, which is owners have control rights, but do not own the company and do not own the board. And that creates, you know, challenges for the owners when the board feels a bit independent, looking at the long-term interest. But then it's a fair game. And that's where the international financial institution is very important, which is teamwork requires 3 people. You know, when you have 2 people, then it's love or hate. You know, then you have conservatives, Labor, Republicans, Democrats. So teamwork requires 3 people. And I think the real trinity is the owner, the board, and the supervisory board, and the executive board. And value creation requires alignment between the 3. And that is, I think, what we're trying to create and recreate. So I was happy to see that. Unfortunately, I think we were right, that Naftogaz without a board was quite destructive. The owner lost trust, and then the owner said, okay, we have to go back to a board, whether we like it or not. You know, that is institutionalizing the trust, and that's what we're trying to do. Now, having said this, best governance is when the board doesn't talk too much. The more the board talks, the more the governance is problematic. So I do like the one person who speaks for the company. You know, if 3 people speak, you have 3 different views. So Alexey speaks for the company, and I think let's hope that the board doesn't have to speak too much.
Thank you very much, Ludo.
But it is a challenge. It is a challenge, no question. But we all feel Ukrainians today, you know. So at least those that are committed, and I must say, it's a privilege to serve.
Indeed, it is. Thank you very much. And let me now turn to Dan Bilak. So how to define Dan? Dan is, as I was saying to somebody outside, is first of all a friend, but is also a member of the territorial forces. He's a very prominent lawyer in the country. He's a former top civil servant as head of Ukraine Invest and advisor to the Prime Minister Groisman, and is a former supervisory board member in a few SOEs or SOBs. So I think he can tell us a bit how he sees the issue of governance in SOEs, both from a private sector experience, but also as a practitioner. And then over to you.
Thank you, Matteo, and thank you for inviting me. Actually, I'd just like to play off of Professor van der Heyden's excellent presentation, talking about the times when I was the advisor to Prime Minister Groisman and at Ukrainian Invest, because I think that's relevant both to the public and the private sector experience. What we've heard from our colleagues online and today really comes down to a fundamental issue of communication, in my view. You can have all the corporate governance rules and regulations that you want, but unless they are properly applied and respected at all levels, they're never going to work. And there's always been a tendency of any reforms in Ukraine, and I've been in the Ukrainian government 4 times, twice in the Ministry of Justice, twice in the Cabinet of Ministers, and advisor to 2 prime ministers. And we always have this problem with reform where we try to make the perfect the enemy of the good. And I think that what you've just heard Professor van der Heyden describe is actually enormous progress. And from what we heard from Mr. Chernyshov and Mr. Umerov, I mean, we had 80 years of a very different governance model. And those are highly institutionalized behavior of control at every level, up and down. Breaking those kinds of systems is extraordinarily difficult, especially when you don't have the institutional capacity inside government to do it. I used to tell business associations who always complained to me when I was at Ukrainian Invest, you're not doing this, you're not doing this, you're not doing this. I said, don't come to me with your problems, come to me with your solutions. It's not that we hate you, it's not that we're incompetent, totally. It's that we do not have the institutional capacity to deal with all of this at the same time. And I think that one of the problems, Naftogaz is a great example, both in terms of how not to do corporate governance and now how to do corporate governance. The first iteration, where you had essentially the donors helping the government appoint board members, led to essentially the board being captured by the CEO. And essentially what you were talking about boards shouldn't be visible and shouldn't talk in public. All we had was just a public free-for-all. And this was a disaster. I had recommended to the Prime Minister, I'll say it now, that he fire the board. And I said, let's do the proper, there had been a new regulation brought in, proper competitions. He wouldn't do it for political reasons. He said, I don't want to upset the donors, et cetera, et cetera. But and we have an investigation, a criminal investigation today that may not have happened had we had a proper board supervision of the CEO at that time. So I think that this issue of communication also goes to communicating government's intentions to the private sector. And I think what Mr. Sobolev was talking about the various options of state-owned enterprise goes to what is in this draft law that we've actually been working on with EBRD for a very long time. Hopefully it gets passed. But it's really the fundamental view is to have a state ownership policy so that everybody understands what is a state-owned enterprise. There's more than one. They serve more than one function. Some are socioeconomic, some are social, some are not anything. Some are just basically captured by vested interests who have privatized the income and left the liabilities with the state and need to be disposed of. How much corporate governance do you put into a state-owned enterprise? Or do you just sell it off, or do you just close it off? I mean, these are important questions. And it makes a difference to the private sector because before the war, they had I was leading advising a consortium that was looking at UMCC, the big titanium combinat that was put up for sale. And this was a monster, a Soviet era monster. And we were trying to wrap our heads around what this was. And, it was very difficult to understand what the corporate governance was, how the decisions were being made, what was the land ownership, because that's a big problem with privatizations, because most private state-owned companies hold their land in permanent ownership, permanent use, not in lease or ownership. And that for a foreign investor is like, what the hell is this? and the Ukrainians can't explain it. And it has to be given back to the local authorities in order to be given back to you, which leads to all sorts of complications. Licenses, who has the licenses to explore, to sell, etc. All of this needs to be made a no-brainer before you put it up for sale. And that is fundamentally a corporate governance issue between the state and the state-owned enterprise, starting with the appointment of a good supervisory board. When we talk about investment, so that's privatization. If we're talking about investment into companies, when I was at Ukraine Invest, I can count on the fingers of both hands how many foreign big airplane manufacturers wanted to do joint ventures with Antonov. I mean, Antonov is still a jewel in the Ukrainian crown. It has decades-old innovations that everybody still wants. And we couldn't do anything with it because it was part of Ukroboronprom, which is this sort of opaque, vague combinat that nobody really understands what that means. Nobody understands how it works. There's been lots of allegations of corruption, and so nobody could touch Antonov. Hence the degradation and the destruction of value that otherwise could have been used for the benefit of the state. So then we get to Ukroboronprom. Now that I've dissed it, I'm going to actually compliment it. We just did a transaction where we were acting for Rheinmetall in a joint venture with Ukroboronprom, and I just went, oh my God, this is going to be a nightmare. And the client said, we have 2 weeks to do this deal. I said, never going to happen. In my experience, if you're lucky, we'll get it done in 2 months, let alone longer. We did it. It had a super professional group of people. We were dealing with the board. We were dealing with the finance people. We were dealing with the legal team, and I was blown away. So that is actually, for me, become a model in the private sector for investment, for joint venturing with state-owned enterprises, those that you don't want to let go, as Alexey was talking about. There may be good reasons for hanging on to them. If we had a state owner policy that everybody knows about and understands, then we could have that discussion. So what does the private sector want? It wants transparency, it wants consistency, and it wants predictability. And every time there's another scandal where the state takes a private company, even an oligarch company, into state ownership, it creates complications for the private sector because now we don't know what the rules are. Are we going to get squeezed out? Do they have special rules? And guess what? They do have special rules. State-owned enterprises, especially ones that perform a commercial function, are not regulated by the civil code, just by the civil code of Ukraine. They actually have their own set of rules called the economic code of Ukraine, which was a messy temporary, which like income tax turns to be permanent, temporary compromise when we passed the civil code in the 1990s. I was in the Ministry of Justice of Ukraine back then, so I know how this happened. And the Donetsky academics said, we need this economic code to regulate state-owned enterprises. It's now in first reading been repealed, but it's still not been made law. This has to be a priority for the government and the Verkhovna Rada to get rid of, so that when the state enters the marketplace, it plays by exactly the same rules as all other companies play by, and are regulated by a very excellent civil code of Ukraine. In fact, it's one of the best civil codes. It was passed in the mid-90s. It's one of the best civil codes in Europe, borrowed from the Quebec Civil Code, the Dutch Civil Code, and the German Civil Code. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dan. Before I pass the floor to Heather Goddard, the Counselor for Economic Affairs to the US Embassy for a follow-up question, may I ask Ludo if you want to reply to Dan, in particular on the point of having a constructive cooperation with the shareholder and avoid talking to the shareholders through the media or through other stakeholders, as has happened in the past in Naftogaz?
Oh no, I think this is fundamental, which is that conversation needs to happen face-to-face, needs to be confidential. This is where transparency is a bit of an issue, because too much transparency hurts transparency. But I think value creation means you have alignment between the owner, the state. I call them stakeholder, instead of shareholder. When the state is a shareholder, that's not the same as a shareholder. So stakeholder, supervisory board, and executive board. And I think it starts with the state, which is this. What is very different in when you have identifiable owners is the owner is responsible for crafting the mission, which is the owner defines value creation. So value creation is not profitability or share market price. It's actually what does the owner want from the company? And so the dialogue can only happen if the owner is clear about the mission. And that mission cannot change when the prime minister changes or when there is a person that changes, because in energy, the time length is between 5 and 20 years, sometimes 40 years with nuclear reactors. So you need to have a constancy of mission, and that's where a sovereign wealth fund typically is a better instrument or better institutionalization of the mission, because the state wealth fund, will actually define a mission. That is not very well understood. We did a seminar on governance for one of the Middle Eastern countries, and they said we're strong believers in governance. Fine, we have the program, but then the government doesn't give us a mission. So then we can't start a discussion, because then actually the board or the CEO can do whatever they want. That is not the point. The state is the state and has to define. So I would say good dialogue on the mission. That doesn't mean you can't influence the mission. That doesn't mean you can't give the feedback. But as a board member, you do not set the mission of a company that's owned by somebody else, whether you're a family company or a state-owned company. So the clarity of the mission, the viability of the mission, and then that gives you, because the Ukrainian government also, KPIs. Well, it's easy. KPI is progress on the mission. Are you making, so let's not make things too complicated. OECD guidelines, clear mission, nomination with international stakeholders, and hold people accountable, including the board. And I think, then they will go. I must admit, I am floored, by what people in UGV do. The 3 miles from the front line, and they're repairing, electric stations, the day after some people have been hurt. It's just amazing. But I would say UGV is continuing to work. The hope is we'll produce more than last year. And congratulations to the management and to the people on the ground. And that actually means that the war is not an excuse to not make progress. And I would say, let's make progress on corporate governance quick, because you need it now in order to invest for the future. So I would say martial law is not an excuse. You have to take into account. It is a very special situation, but the craftiness and the entrepreneurship of the Ukrainians, I think for me, it says we don't need to stop. However, governance is always entrepreneurship within a frame. And I think we need to be clear on the frame and the institutionalization and the institutions that maintain the frame or that change the frame. And I think we can, as a board, we can change the frame within the company, but we cannot change the frame that's given by the owner. I don't know if that helps you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd love to continue this debate for the next few hours, but I'm told that we have
all afternoon.
Yeah, exactly. I'm told that we have a hard stop actually at 12:35. Let's make 12:38. Heather, what is the position of the US in all these, and in particular on the new legislative initiative?
Yes, I am excited by this conversation. It's an exciting time to partner with Ukraine and the United States, and I think all of our G7 plus partners and allies of Ukraine agree that we are in a fight against Russia, but we are also in a fight for the future. And what you've heard today shows how serious the government of Ukraine and its partners are about this fight for the future. And this fight for the future means strengthening institutions, and judicial institutions, anti-corruption institutions, and corporate governance institutions. And so Ukraine is on the move. I think we've heard that from throughout this week, this conference. Things are changing. Things are different in Ukraine than they were even 3-4 years ago. This is a different mood. It's a different time period. And we feel that in our partnership with Ukraine. And so we definitely agree, violently agree with what has been said by our Ukrainian partners here, that we need strong institutional laws that will enshrine corporate governance that is in alignment with OECD principles, and that builds the institutions that the people of Ukraine and that the international community and the international business community can rely on and trust. And so we are making the argument to our business community in the United States, and I think all the G7 is also making this argument that the time is now for the international business community to come back and take a look at the new Ukraine that's emerging. And in order for us to make that case, we need to see that constant improvement on the governance side and not to go backwards. And the fact of the matter is that Ukraine has functioning independent supervisory boards of some of its SOEs right now that are working really well in a time of martial law, in a time of existential battle. And we want to see that enshrined in legal legislation, which is why 5593D is so important, and that it's passed in a form that does reflect those OECD guidelines and shows the continuation of Ukraine's just truly amazing progress in this area and in this space, and the opportunity that will bring Ukraine the prosperous and democratic future that it deserves after this war. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your thoughts, Heather. Well, I think we really need to close here. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions from the audience, but I would strongly encourage you to reach out to the panelists that will be here during lunch. And we have a changeover now for the next panel.